I hope people will start looking at the individuals that they are attempting to influence and look at them as individuals and not simply focus on how they like to have conversations.
This episode is brought to you by 4 books. As always, the book Conversations, How to Manage Your Business Relationships One Conversation at a Time by yours truly, Ivan Farber, and 3 other books, Influence People, Powerful Everyday Opportunities to Persuade That Are Lasting and Ethical, Persuasive Selling for Relationship-Driven Insurance Agents, and The Influencer. All 4 books are available on Amazon and Kindle. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Conversations About Conversations. This is a show for people who want to become more effective in their conversations and their business relationships. Our goal is to make the business world a better place, one conversation at a time. Our guest today is perfect to help us in our endeavor. His mission is to help apply influence in everyday situations and help people boost their results. Our guest is named Brian Ahearn. Brian is the Chief Influence Officer at a company called Influence People. He's an author, TEDx speaker, international trainer, coach, and consultant. His LinkedIn courses on persuasive selling and coaching have been viewed by more than 500,000 people around the world. His first book, Influence People, was named one of the 100 best influence books of all time. Please help me welcome back to Conversations About Conversations, Brian Ahearn. Brian, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Ivan. It's been nice getting to know you and staying in touch since we had our first episode.
We are both very fortunate to know each other.
I agree. And technology, that's where technology is wonderful. Social media helping us to be social.
Brian and I have 3 topics for today's conversation. Number 1, we're going to do a quick review of the 7 universal principles of influence. Number 2, we're going to have a discussion of how to deal with 4 major personality types. And then number 3, we're going to talk about a strategy for listening that is going to make you an all-star listener. That's what we have in mind. Buckle your seatbelts, put your tray tables in an upright and locked position, and let's go. Brian, would you care to make an opening statement?
Well, I'm just happy to be back. And I appreciate, Ivan, that since our first conversation and you're following my material, that you enjoyed it enough to want to have me back. And there's a whole different angle that we can take today. So I'm excited for the listeners.
Well, you're welcome. And not only am I delighted to have you back, but I'm a big fan. I have introduced you to 3 other podcasts, and I've then listened to those podcasts, and you do a tremendous job. So I feel really fortunate. Our audience is really fortunate to be your student today, because I want to think of myself as the student, you as the teacher. And I guess let's go through the agenda. Let's start with the 7 universal principles.
Okay, I'll give a quick definition for each. So I always start with the principle of liking. I think it's foundational to building relationships, and everybody gets this one. We prefer to say yes to those we know and like. That is so common that people might be going, duh, everybody knows that. The second principle that I talk about is reciprocity. And reciprocity is the natural obligation we have to give back when someone first gives to us. So both of these principles, if you like somebody and you're a genuine giver, can help you build relationship. There's a third principle that is also a relationship builder, and it's called unity. And that's the principle that Robert Cialdini introduced to the world back in 2016. And unity is about shared identity. It's easier for us to say yes to those who are of us, of our family, of our tribe. I always use the example of my father in the Marines. There's a deep bond. It goes beyond mere having similarities, but it's a deep, deep bond. So those 3 principles, when you're looking to build relationship, very, very good. The next principles that we come to are really good for dealing with uncertainty. And the first one that we talk about here is authority. And authority is simply, we defer to people who have superior wisdom or expertise when we're making decisions, right? We just feel better when a doctor gives us medical advice or an attorney gives us legal advice. We naturally defer to those people that we see as experts. The other principle that's good for overcoming uncertainty is consensus or social proof. And that is the principle that says we look to others to see how we should behave in certain situations. We are social creatures. It is easy for us to figure out what the right thing to do is typically when lots of other people, especially those who are very similar to us, are doing something. And then the final group of principles that we talk about are very, very useful for moving people to action. The first one we talk about there is consistency. And consistency says that we feel this internal psychological pressure, but also an external social pressure to be consistent in what we say and what we do. And with this, I always talk about, instead of telling people what to do, when you ask, you can gain commitment. And when somebody has said yes to that, it's more likely they'll do what you need them to do. And the final principle, and everybody gets this one too, is scarcity. It says we value things more when we believe they're rare or going away. Just think about Black Friday and how it changes people dramatically just because of these deals that they might not get any other time of year. So when we think something is less available, we just have a natural tendency to want that thing even more.
Now, one thing I didn't say in your introduction is that you're one of a very few amount of people who are certified in Robert Cialdini's methods and beliefs on influence. I'm going to put in the show notes a link to the first episode that we did. It was a 53-minute episode where we talked about how you came in contact with Robert Cialdini and how you came to do what you're doing today. It's a great episode if people want to go back. But for now, I just want to say thank you for reiterating the 7 principles.
Oh, you're welcome.
And let's move into dealing with the personality types. I believe there are 4 different personality types.
Right. So many years ago, when I was in my corporate role and we had brought an outside vendor in to do some training, they did some personality tests and talked about different personalities. And frankly, I'd been through something like that decades before, and it was a waste of time because nobody really did anything with it. And so I was prompted by a guy who was in my department, and he said, man, it'd be really cool if we could tie Robert Cialdini's principles to these different personality types to see which principles are most effective when you're dealing with different types of people. So I thought, wow, that's a really interesting idea. And what I did was I developed a survey for my blog readers. I would have them self-identify as to which personality they felt they were, and then they would take a survey. The reality was it was the same survey for everybody, but I had very natural segmentation. And we tried to look at how are people responding to questions about relationship building or dealing with uncertainty or motivating people to action. So once I got all the results, I worked with a guy who was an intern at our company who was just short of genius, probably was genius. I mean, he was a triple major in college with a 4.0 across the board in actuarial sciences, economics, and finance. Just a brilliant guy. So he analyzed the data and he gave me the thumbs up that it was legit. And I began to use it in the training that I now do when I talk about selling. So that's the background on this. When you use the term deal, how to deal with people, that's a very specific acronym that I came up with. It stands for driver, expressive, amiable, and logical. And I chose that because we deal with people. And when I'm working with salespeople, they hope to close deals. So it makes it memorable to them. But it's essentially like DISC, but the focus is not on you as the individual. It's about assessing the person that you're with. And if you can get a handle on their personality type, the results from my survey showed that there were clear principles that would be more effective with certain personality types. So that's the background to everything.
Got it. Well, one of my questions for you is, how do you tell who is who? And probably makes sense for you to describe each of the 4.
Okay.
And then give us the clues on how do you determine.
Okay. No disrespect to any of the other personality tests that are out there, but you can't, when you're in a sales situation, you can't ask your prospective client, hey, would you take this quick personality assessment so I can understand you better? You need something that's quick and simple. It's probably not 100% accurate all the time, but it can be very accurate if you know much about your potential client or the individual just that you happen to be speaking with. And so we looked at, on an XY axis, we looked at the Y axis, and we had on that, it was Y horizontal. On the horizontal axis, the demarcation was, is the person you're talking to more task-focused or are they more relationship-focused? And that's usually pretty easy for people to figure out. Is the person you're talking to somebody who would probably stay late at work and pass up the opportunity to go to the social event? Or would they be the person who would say, hey, I'll come in early tomorrow and finish this up. I want to go hang out with, my coworkers. So task-driven versus relationship. And then the other axis that we take a look at is, are the people you're talking to, are they about controlling situations and others, or are they more focused on self-control? And again, you can usually tell, there's some people who come into a room and they want to dominate a conversation. They want to be the one to volunteer to lead. And there are other people who are a little more passive about some of those things. So that's what we have on our XY axis. And so when we're in the upper right quadrant, that's D for driver. So the driver is the person who is very task focused and wants to be in control. When I ask students, give me a person who exemplifies this, I hear people like Steve Jobs, Donald Trump, General Patton. Those are people who are like off the charts, want to be in control and focused on getting things done. And then we move down to the person who's more relationship oriented, but also likes to be in control. So a good example that comes up with that one all the time is Oprah Winfrey. Like, Oprah's all about you and she's all about your story and she wants to help and things like that. But from everything I've ever heard, she's in complete control of her media empire. Now we move over to the person who is also relationship focused. So we're in the lower left quadrant, but the person who's more relationship oriented and is not about controlling you or others. They're more about self-control and their locus of concern. And that's a tougher one for people to come up with, because those aren't people who typically are in the limelight. But I think the person who exemplifies that one best is Mother Teresa. Right? I mean, she had a huge impact on the world. She wasn't trying to control anybody or anything. She was just there helping the poor. She was obviously relational. And yet through her humanitarian efforts, she stood in front of the UN and got to speak to the world. Our final is the L, and I'm sorry, that was A for amiable. And then our final is L for logical. And the logical person is a task-driven, but not about controlling others. They're more focused on controlling their own sphere of influence. And people that they typically come up with here are Bill Gates, Albert Einstein, right? People who are just very much in the head and about getting things done. It's not that they're not friendly, but again, they're not going to prioritize relationship over getting done what needs to be done. So we have driver, expressive, amiable, logical.
Okay, so above the line is driver and logical, because they're more task focused.
Right.
Below the line is expressive and amiable, because they're more people focused.
Right.
And then to the right of the vertical axis is more control oriented. And then to the left is more control oriented of others. And the left is more control of yourself.
Correct. And part of the reason that I have students, when we're in a workshop, identify somebody that they see as that typical person, because they won't remember the paragraph of description. The descriptions are great, and people would read them and go like, wow, that's me. Well, that one thing isn't me. But they can get a good handle on what they are when they read a description, but they're not going to go into a sales situation and look at somebody like you and start going through this litany of words. But if they can say, wow, Ivan reminds me of a little Einstein, they've got some connection, and they can start looking to see if there are other clues that would help them determine that that's the personality style that you have. Because then the next thing they need to do is understand, well, which principles do I want to focus on when I'm having a conversation with that individual? Because you can talk about the same product, service, or idea, the very same thing to 4 different people, and you're going to use different psychology and present it differently.
I'm laughing inside because nobody's ever described me as a little Einstein before. But before we go into the 4 and how to deal with each one, I am curious, where do you fall in the deal?
People always think I'm expressive because I am on stage and I like talking, but I'm actually logical, and I've always been that. When I took the personality test more than 30 years ago, when I was working with the Travelers, I was logical. When I took it about 15 years ago, when we had the vendor in, I still fell into the logical. I've become a lot more relational. So I've kind of moved within that quadrant. I used to be pretty off the charts, but anyway, people just make an assumption because you're in front of people that makes you expressive. And that's not necessarily the case. My wife's an expressive.
And which of the four do you think I fall into?
I just threw that out there, but I think you're more relationship oriented. So I wouldn't have you above the line. I would probably have you in the amiable, but close, moving more towards the expressive.
I don't know where to put myself based on what you've described so far, but now let's get into more of the nuts and bolts and I'll see where I think I fit.
Okay. So once people have identified an individual that they think typifies, then it's easier when you start talking about the principles. Because if I were to tell you like, hey, Ivan, you got 5 minutes with Donald Trump, what are you going to say? What principles do you think would be most effective with somebody like him? Well, you're not going to tap into the principle of liking. He does not care about being your friend. You're probably not going to try to engage reciprocity. There's nothing you can give him that he can't go get for himself, and many other people who are in that category. But you do want to tap into consistency, right? People who are drivers, typically whatever they've said or done, they believe deeply that what they've said and done is right. And so if you can line up what you're asking of them by tapping into consistency and showing them it aligns with already what they think and believe, that makes it much easier for them to say yes. The other principle is authority. They typically are going to respect people that they see as peers or above themselves. They're going to respect data. And then the third thing is scarcity. You don't go into somebody who's in a position like that, like a Donald Trump or a Steve Jobs or whomever, and say, hey, we're losing $1 million, or excuse me, that you're not going to go in and say, hey, I got $1 million idea, because they're going to say dime a dozen. But when you go in and say we're losing $1 million a year, that catches their attention. And then you have an opportunity to say, because we're not doing X, Y, and Z, we're losing $1 million a year. So that slight reframe from gain to loss by using scarcity will help you make your case better. So I'll pause there to see if you have any questions.
No, I was going to encourage you to keep going.
Okay. So then if we move to the expressive, now, again, if you've got your 5 minutes with someone like Oprah Winfrey, what principles are you going to tap into? Well, because someone like that is relationship oriented, you want to tap into the principle of liking. And as I say that, it's because the survey results showed this. So the more that she knows and likes you, the easier it will be for her to want to help you. People in that category, a lot of times they trade favors. I mean, think politicians. So anything that you can do, not that you could give her anything that she doesn't already have or could get, but the gesture of you doing something is going to probably get something heartfelt in return. And so you've got an opportunity to build relationship there too. And then the third principle that stood out with people who self-identified as expressives was consensus. People in that category are paying attention to trends. Again, if you think politicians and entertainers, quite often they're in that category. They want to know what people are thinking and how they're feeling and what they're doing, because they are going to adjust accordingly. So those would be the three principles that you'd want to focus on prior to going into that conversation with the expressive.
So when you first described the four, I thought I was a D, a driver. And then when I asked you, you thought expressive. I didn't identify with that, but now that you've explained it, I mean, I think of myself as like an Oprah Winfrey of podcasting. Why not?
Well, you know, most people are not as off the charts as the people that we're describing. They just give you a very tangible individual to consider. Many people are very close to the middle. And so even somebody who's a driver, they might still be closer to that logical. They might be down real close to the relational line. So I just want people to understand that we don't all have to be way off the charts on these things.
And it could be Venn diagram like or floating in different situations.
Yeah.
You said I was close to the line of amiable. Let's talk about amiable.
Okay. So now again, you imagine you're going to have some time with someone like Mother Teresa, that person who is relationship oriented, but a little more laid back. Certainly liking, that's going to come into play. If you form relationship, they're going to like you and it's easier for them to do what you need. The principle of consensus. Obviously, they are concerned with what other people are doing, how they're thinking, how they're feeling, etc. And then this one's a surprise. Everybody would say reciprocity because that's a relationship builder. That was number 4 in the survey results. The principle of authority. People who were in that category as they filled out the survey tended to defer to people that they saw in positions of authority or had expertise. So that is one that you'd want to bring into that conversation. But again, reciprocity is a very close fourth. And so if you have an opportunity to genuinely give, you absolutely want to do it. Okay. And now we move to our final logical. Okay. So you get your time with a Bill Gates or a Albert Einstein. What principles are you going to use to try to influence that person? Well, absolutely authority. Right? These are data-driven people. If you can bring in data, experts, et cetera, makes it easier for them to buy into your idea. The principle of consistency, because when they've said or done something, they believe they're right. But I think the motivation for that's a little different than the driver. They are trusting their intellect. I think drivers are trusting their gut. And so they still come to the same thing about, what I've said, done, or believe, I think is right, but it comes out of a different place. So that one is one. And the third one really surprises people. It's reciprocity. And you wouldn't think that somebody who's logical would be responding to reciprocity until you recognize, when I have an opportunity to go deep with this and we talk about reciprocity, we say it's a rule that we learn from childhood, right? When you were little and somebody did something kind, your mom or dad probably said, Ivan, what do you say? And you said, thank you. And you started being conditioned that when someone does something, you're expected to do something in return. So these people are responding to the rule, not necessarily out of the goodness of their heart, like maybe the expressive, but out of I'm supposed to. Logical people are rule followers. And the best example that I can give is for any of your listeners who used to watch The Big Bang Theory. There was a great episode where Penny walked in at Christmas with a hat on and a gift for Sheldon. And he says, what is that? And she goes, it's a gift. And he says, you're not giving me a gift. You're giving me an obligation. Don't you understand? Gift giving, the basis of it is reciprocity. Now I have to go get you a gift of equal value, yada, yada, yada. So it was a beautiful example where he just felt like he had to do it because he's supposed to do it. So that was the third principle that was very effective when dealing with logical individuals.
So in order to make this work in Brian Ahearn world and influence people's world, you have to understand the 7 universal principles really, really well. Mm-hmm. And I've been working on them and, of course, put out the episode at the end of last year, put out a number of YouTube shorts. And so I've learned them, but this is something I heard you say before. It's one thing to know something, and it's another thing to apply something. Mm-hmm. You're now giving me a framework with which I can start to apply some of these principles, which I think will actually help me better understand them if I'm going into a conversation with somebody who I believe is a driver. Then I'll have to re-listen to this episode and take notes about which principles. But that would be a really good start if I know going in, okay, they need authority, they need reciprocity, they need scarcity, so forth and so on. So it's starting to come together for me. Thank you.
And I think most of the time people are going to probably have an opportunity to do some planning, especially if it's a sales call. And so if they've been able to look up information, have conversations, and kind of get a handle, they know what they want to talk about, and they start filtering it through the principles that would be most effective. That's where they have the best opportunity to succeed. So, at the beginning, when I talked about the principles, I said framework of relationship builders, dealing with uncertainty, or motivating people to action. That's one way to think about them. But now here's a different way where you understand the personality. You can now use these principles a little bit differently. And my book on persuasive selling has a third model, which looks at the sales cycle. And we won't get into that because it's too many steps right now.
Well, now that I've heard you talk about all 4, I do think I'm an expressive. I think that you got that right. I wouldn't have associated with the moniker at first, but now that you've explained it, and I do think you're right too. Like I could float over to amiable. I could float up to logical. I could float up to driver, but if I had to pick one, I would do that.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that thorough explanation.
Oh, you're welcome.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about deal before we move on to listening?
Well, I think the big thing is to understand your audience and not go in with a canned approach every time. Just because you are a relational person doesn't mean the other person is. And you have to be a little bit of a chameleon. You have to play to them. And so you don't go in and just say, I'll win them over and spend 15 minutes of your 30-minute sales call just shooting the breeze while somebody who's a driver is just looking at their watch saying, get to the point, or you're wasting my time. So you've got to have that ability to be able to be a chameleon and make changes as necessary.
Chapter 1 of my book is called Build Rapport. And among the other strategies that I include is paying attention to what Tony Robbins calls metaprograms. So determining if someone is a thinker or a feeler, if someone's visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, if someone sorts by others or sorts by themselves, if they're convinced their strategy is a one-time or a persistent. And I can now see, using that framework and your framework, how complementary they would be and how essential it is to have rapport, establish it, and also maintain it.
Yeah. And the principles, once you internalize them and you know the principles you want to use, you and I could say the same thing, but you might say, I see, where I'm saying, I feel, I think. So that's where a lot of that comes in, but you could be even more tailored to that audience because you understand, you've listened to them and they keep saying, I see, I see, I see. And then you start using that back with them. So you're speaking the same language in essence.
Precisely. Now, one of the ways that you need to apply all of this and also build and maintain extraordinary rapport is by listening. So that's my segue to how do you become a listening star?
Okay. So when I talk to audiences about upping their listening skills, I use the term stars, and there are 5 parts to it, like the 5 parts of a star. And the first S is stop. Just stop everything that you're doing so you can give your full attention to the other person. Then it's T for tone, right? Tone quite often indicates mood. And when you understand where somebody is emotionally, it can make it easier. And so you want to, you don't just listen to the words. I mean, you've been married a long time. I've been married a long time. When I say, Jane, how are you? And she goes, fine. I know she's not fine, right? I need to dig in and do something different. A is ask clarifying questions. I'm not a fan of interrupting people when they're talking, except when you have a question. So if you're sharing a lot of information and I'm not sure I understand you, and I might say, hey, Ivan, hang on a second. Can I ask you about, because I want clarity. It does show too active listening, especially when you're on the phone. So that keeps you engaged. It lets the other person know that you're actively listening, and it hopefully will help prevent going further in the conversation with a misunderstanding. And then the R is restate. So in your own words, restate what you think that other person is trying to express. If you can tie an emotion to it, great, go ahead and do so. But try to get that confirmation. If somebody says, no, that's not it at all, then I say, help me understand. I must have missed something along the way. But I'm going back and I'm starting at square one and I'm stopping in tone, etc. But I want to make sure I understand what they're saying before I share my viewpoint, give advice, or anything else. And then the final letter in stars is S for scribble. So I always encourage people to take notes. Now, it's not about writing the next great American novel. It's about kind of bullet pointing things. And so you can bullet point so that you can go back and ask more questions once the major part of the conversation maybe has happened. It will give you trigger points when you go back to fill in your notes so that you have a fuller view of that conversation if you're going into like your agency sales management system or something like that. So it's about being judicious and taking notes. You don't want to do too much, because if you do, then you're not listening. And you really don't want to use your computer if you can avoid it, because you get too engaged with the keys. You try to almost transcribe and you're missing much of the tone and the emotional content and things. So Those are the 5 points of the star. And what I always tell people is what I talk about, it's a skill, but it is not a skill that you don't possess. In that, I don't know about you, Ivan, but I've never been able to dunk a basketball. It's a skill I do not possess and never will at my age and my height and things. But everything I just talked about with stars is a choice. And if you make the choice to stop, focus on tone, ask the questions, restate, and take notes, you will become much more effective at your ability to listen to people.
Without a doubt, this is a valuable framework and one that I want to teach a lot of people. So thank you for creating it, sharing it, and explaining it. Is there anything else that you want to say about stars?
If you get really good at this, you'll get along with your spouse a lot better. Because early on, my wife would be like, you teach classes on listening and you didn't even, but I have gotten a lot better. And she's always surprised that when I see somebody that maybe I haven't seen for years, that I can remember so much about them or the conversations that we've had. And that means a lot to people. When I reach back on the phone, or if I put an email and I ask how something was going, people are like, wow, you remembered that. And so it's a wonderful skill, not only for you, but to make the people that you listen to feel really good about the relationship.
You don't learn anything when you're talking. I had a mentor early on in my career who I watched her in a meeting and she didn't say a word. And after the meeting, I said, Catherine, why did you not say anything? Weren't you in charge of the meeting? And she taught me the lesson that it's not the person who is talking who's in control of the meeting. It's the person asking the questions and listening who's totally guiding that conversation. So I want to give you a quick visual for that. Whenever I talk about questions and the value of questions, I use a picture of like a sailboat, because I say questions are like the rudder and it steers the boat. So the boat is large and the conversation is the wind, but you can steer by the questions that you ask. And people then start to get that. They realize this small part is what actually is guiding the larger piece, the ship. I'm going to not necessarily try to one-up you, but just to say I have many metaphors about questions as well. I think of them as the guardrails for the conversation. I think of them as the paddles in the canoe. Mm-hmm. And the last metaphor that I use is I think of questions as the Swiss Army knives of conversations, because there are so many utilities that you can use questions for. And in fact, if you don't have a mastery of the use of questions, I don't really believe you can have a mastery of conversations. Mm-hmm.
Yep, I agree. Otherwise, it's just a monologue and people will tune out. Questions keep them engaged too. It makes them think, it makes them answer, and you get that dialogue going.
Most of the conversations in the world are serial monologues. Someone says one thing, the other person says the other thing. Nobody stopped and listened. Mm-hmm. Very rarely are they asking clarifying questions, mostly assumptions. Mm-hmm. Well, we covered the 3 agenda items. We were going to talk about the 7 universal principles of influence. We're talking about how to deal with the 4 different personality types, and then how to be a listening star. So I'd like to say, as part of your closing statement, is there anything else that you want to make sure is a part of this conversation?
Well, earlier, you and I were talking before we went on air that I'm going to be doing a TED Talk next week, and it's on persuasion, a topic that we have not spent any time talking about. So if people want to learn about that aspect of psychology, hopefully within several weeks after the event, it will be online. And so perhaps we could promote that and talk about that as yet another way to help people be more influential.
I will be delighted to help you promote it. So just let me know how I can help with that.
Thank you.
And then as a last question for you, for your closing statement, what specifically would you like people to do as a result of hearing the conversation that we just had?
I hope people will start looking at the individuals that they are attempting to influence, be it at home or at work or wherever they are, and look at them as individuals and not simply focus on how they like to have conversations. Again, if I'm really good at the relational stuff, I'm just going to try to win somebody over. Use psychology that will resonate with that person. So you can talk about the same thing, idea, product, service, whatever, but you may talk about it differently based on the psychology that you want to use. And I think if people do that, they will have a much better response in terms of their ability to ethically influence people.
Brian, I want to thank you for this conversation and for the relationship that we've built, the reciprocity, the mutual liking. We're in a position to influence each other because we both believe in those principles, and not to do it in a manipulative way, but in an ethical way, which is something that you talk about so much. So I want to conclude with a couple more comments. Number one, I acknowledge you and appreciate you.
Thank you.
Number two, I'm excited about your TED Talk. Number three, I'm excited for the audience to get to know your work better and to have the opportunity to study and practice these frameworks. As I may have shared with you, my long-term objective is to create Conversations University. I'm saying right now that I believe what we just did is class number one of the Conversation School or the Conversations Academy. And I'm going to need a dean. And I picture you as like the dean of influence. So I'll put that out there.
All right, we can talk about that more. I was the head of a corporate university for a while. I technically was kind of a dean.
Well, there are no accidents. I want to thank Patrick Galvin, who connected us back in the fall. Patrick is author of The Connector's Way. So it's only fitting that the author of The Connector's Way is the person who connected us. Yep. And with that, I want to thank you, Brian. I want to thank Patrick. I want to thank everybody out there for being a part of this conversation about bringing better conversations to the business world and then ultimately making a better world.